Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Washington, D.C. at the Heritage Foundation think tank, and we're talking to one of the nation's top North Korea analysts, Bruce Klingner, who has analyzed this very interesting power and has job security for a long time because of it. Bruce, what's different about this missile test? The North Koreans have been sort of on a steady path in doing this. From a capabilities standpoint, talk to us a little bit about how this is potentially game-changing or not.
Right. It's really the manifestation of a long-predicted capability that North Korea has been working on for some time. And it does come in the context of a lot of other breakthroughs and missile tests and missile exercises. So in the last 2 years, Kim Jong-un has done more missile tests and exercises than his father and grandfather did combined. So what this is really the demonstration of another step forward in their ICBM capability to threaten the United States with a nuclear warhead. So this missile was flown in an unusually high trajectory so it wouldn't fly over Japan, but also perhaps to test a reentry vehicle. Had it been launched at a normal trajectory, it could have reached perhaps 6,700 kilometers. That's all of Alaska, but it likely was not the full capability, so it likely can hit the continental U.S. itself based on some previous assessments of rocket engine tests. So this is certainly bringing home to a lot of policymakers and pundits and the American public that the U.S. really is going to come under a nuclear threat directly from North Korea. Our allies, South Korea and Japan, have long been under this threat, but now it's coming to the American homeland.
How long before the whole question has been miniaturization of warheads? The North Koreans have been dedicatedly working on that challenge for a while. There was something that we've looked at as well. It was a smaller test in order to try to miniaturize the weapon and actually get it on the rocket. How long before they can put that warhead that they've been working on onto this rocket?
This rocket, we don't know. But a lot of times people have underestimated North Korea. And they've already had 5 nuclear tests. And if you look at the other nuclear powers, after 5, they certainly were, had nuclear warheads. So I think people are downplaying the threat without realizing it. Most analysts think that the Nodong medium-range ballistic missile is already nuclear capable. It already has nuclear warheads for it. So that means South Korea and Japan are today under a nuclear threat. We don't know whether they have the nuclear warheads yet for their intermediate range missiles that can threaten Guam, and we don't think they have it yet for the ICBM, but certainly that's their objective. And actually 4 U.S. 4-star generals or commanders have said we have to assume for planning purposes that North Korea already has the ability to hit the continental U.S. with a nuclear warhead. Most outside experts don't think they're there yet, but that's certainly the objective.
The president said not going to happen, this test wasn't going to happen. During the campaign and a little bit afterwards, he said, hey, I'm willing to talk to the North Koreans, which is something the North Koreans have wanted, those sort of direct talks, not multi-party talks. And the president most recently, when he spoke in Warsaw today, said, look, I'm going to, I'm not going to declare what we're going to do, but there are going to be a whole series of severe things that we're considering. The United States has talked about saying, hey, look, we'll take surgical or unilateral action. You and I talked about that the last time where you sort of said, it's probably better to dial that down a bit. You were part of a conference, sort of a Track 2-ish event where you did talk to some North Korean representatives. Talk to us about what's the way out of this? The president put a lot of stock in the Chinese trying to help. The Chinese never really expressed much of an interest in trying to help. There have been some helpful sanctions that have increased. What's the way forward through this high-tension period, especially given that the North Korean regime is interested in its survival fundamentally? So, starting a war would not seem to be in Kim's interest if he wants to stay in power.
Right. Well, when the president said it won't happen in his tweet, we don't really know what he meant. And if you can parse it, whether he meant an ICBM test wouldn't occur or that North Korea wouldn't complete the ability to have an ICBM, the program itself, we don't know. There has been a lot of signaling from the U.S., really conflicting signaling. In April, there was a lot of messaging from, including the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, suggesting that the U.S. was about to do a preventative attack, a military attack on North Korea to prevent them from completing an ICBM development. Even comments such as the Syrian attack was a message or a signal to North Korea. That's been ratcheted down, but now seems to be going back up. The President talking about he'll do severe things. So we're uncertain whether the U.S. will do something, but my discussions with Trump administration officials suggest that a preventative attack is not being considered, despite a lot of the rhetoric. So a military option, we need to exhaust all the other options first, because any military attack could conceivably lead to an all-out war on the peninsula, and that's hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of casualties in Korea, in Japan, in the United States, if they have an ICBM capability. On the other end, some suggest doing something new, negotiations. We've had 8 international agreements with North Korea, all failed. And in my meetings with North Korean officials, they affirmed what we've been hearing for years, is that denuclearization is totally off the table. There's nothing that the U.S. or Washington or U.S. or South Korea can offer to induce them to abandon their nuclear arsenal. So that really leaves us the pressure strategy, and that's doing things that we've actually been pulling our punches on. North Korea is not the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth, as President Obama asserted. There are things we have not been doing. For example, last week, the Trump administration finally sanctioned a Chinese bank. That's the first one we've done in 10 years, despite lots of evidence that they are involved in North Korean illicit activity. I'm hoping that's the tip of the iceberg, and we are going to more fully enforce U.S. law, because the Chinese entities have been violating U.S. law.
Is that something that is going to have traction, because the Chinese are trying to position and bundle all of these things simultaneously in a vast series of, sort of their broader strategy to expand their influence in the region? How much pressure needs to be applied? Is there enough pressure that can be applied on China to change its direction on North Korea, given the Chinese have made it abundantly clear we do not want a united Korea with America on our doorstep?
Right. Well, there are things that we need to differentiate between diplomatic initiatives and enforcing U.S. laws. So given the centrality of the U.S. dollar, the U.S. financial system, that gives us tremendous leverage. The vast majority of all international transactions in the world, including China and North Korea's, are denominated in dollars. That means they go through U.S. banks, the U.S. financial system. We are obligated to defend our financial system. So if a Chinese entity, if a North Korean entity is misusing our financial system, we have to protect our laws. If we don't sanction those entities, we're giving them de facto immunity from U.S. law. That doesn't guarantee denuclearization. So we need to let China know we're not going after the Chinese government. We're not saying the Chinese government is involved, but we are going to uphold our laws, defend our financial system. And if Beijing is against that, why would they be against us upholding our laws and defending our financial system? So we need to make Beijing clear that we'll do things that are law enforcement, and then the others are diplomatic initiatives that we can discuss.
Do the North Koreans then become more dangerous if they get more cornered?
Well, that's like saying maybe we should never arrest a criminal because they might react strongly if we were to go to arrest them. That's not how you do things. You can't not do what your principles or your laws say you should do because the bad guy may not like it.
And one last question. A series of American presidents have said we will not accept a nuclear North Korea. And we've been living with a nuclear North Korea now for almost a decade. Don't standard deterrent rules apply? The United States was targeted in a massive way by the Soviet Union.
Right.
China targeted the United States. China may well be still targeting the United States with its, as well as Russia with its nuclear weapons. As a kid who grew up in New York City, every time I looked at the Empire State Building, that was ground zero, not the Empire State Building. So at some point, do deterrent rules need to apply? And we go, hey, look, okay, welcome to the club. Here are the rules of the club. And if you do anything, you cease to exist.
Right. We sometimes we get into parsing of words, accept or acknowledge, in that we will never formally accept that North Korea is a nuclear weapon state. We may acknowledge or understand that they do have nuclear weapons. It's sort of like a policeman looking through the window of a hostage situation. He doesn't accept that the criminal has a pistol. It's against the law. But he has to acknowledge that he has that capability. But as you said, with deterrence, we've really been in that game already with North Korea for a long time, and we're going to continue to be in that game as we continue to use techniques and policies to try to get them to denuclearize or constrain their ability to attack us. We are having our military and our allies' militaries there to deter them from using North Korea from using not only the nuclear weapons but their conventional weapons. So, like the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we're in this for the long haul.
Last two questions. We talked to Graham Allison, the Harvard strategist, was in the Pentagon in the 1990s. It's a two-part question. His biggest concern, as you know in his new book, is how North Korea could spark war between China and the United States. That, that unwittingly, everybody may not, sort of the Thucydides trap. Nobody wants to go to war but could end up going to war over that. Is that a concern for you? And I've got one follow-up after that.
I think my greater concern about potential for a war on the peninsula would be miscalculation and escalation. So a miscalculation, you have three large militaries, U.S., North Korea, South Korea, in close proximity to each other. And that each of them has commented that if I detect signs that you are about to attack me, I will preempt. And then there's responses, I will preempt your preemption. So there's a great danger of one side or the other miscalculating and initiating a conflict that may not otherwise have occurred. The other one is escalation. Even a tactical level clash between North and South Korean forces could lead to an expansion and an escalation, perhaps even an all-out war. So I'm more concerned about those, and that's between the U.S. and North Korea. And then whether China gets drawn in, that's obviously yet another escalation.
An in-between question. South Korean leadership has wanted a much more sunshine policy, less of a hard line. We talked about withdrawing THAAD missile batteries, which are so important to both our strategy but also the defense of Korea. Is the new Korean administration's stance tenable as the pressure rises, the concern level rises in the international community over North Korea?
Well, the new South Korean President, Moon Jae-in, has sort of tacked to the center in his comments and his policies since the campaign. So he has adopted more of perhaps the U.S. or the international rhetoric of the need to pressure before you seek to engage. But also he's tried to reach out to North Korea, and they've rebuffed him. They've done numerous missile tests, missile provocations, violations of UN resolutions since his inauguration. He offered non-government humanitarian assistance and seeking civilian exchange of visits. North Korea rejected him. So it's very much like 2009 when President Barack Obama reached out with an open hand of dialogue to North Korea, and North Korea slapped it away. So even those who seek dialogue will find the great disappointment because North Korea doesn't want it.
Last question. Graham Allison told us that in 1994, the entire Pentagon leadership, from General Shalikashvili to Defense Secretary Bill Perry, Ash Carter, who at the time was in the department, were recommending a limited surgical strike against North Korea to stop their nuclear program dead in its tracks at the time. In retrospect, would that have been a good decision given where we are now?
Even if North Korea didn't have nuclear forces at the time, they still had a 1 million-man army. They still had 10,000 artillery tubes that could threaten Seoul without even having to move further forward. So, as I said, when I was in government, we did war games. There were always hundreds of thousands of casualties, and that was even before they had nuclear weapons. So the military option, we always have to have a military there to deter and defend and, if necessary, defeat. But we don't want to go down that option before we've exhausted the others.
And that was, I think, one of the decisions that the factors that President Clinton took into consideration. Bruce, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I look forward. We'll be talking many, many more times before this is resolved. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.